Kathy, if last night felt like a moment when thousands gathered, then the momentum and the defiance is still palpable tonight. Earlier, protesters turned up here at New Scotland Yard to make their voices heard. They are angry. There are accusations that the Metropolitan Police were heavy-handed last night.
And she's come out fighting, but there are still calls for Cressida Dick to go, aren't there?
Yes, repeated calls for the Commissioner to resign. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, says there are still unanswered questions. She has said there now will be a review into exactly what happened. I think the key questions that are going to be asked of the Metropolitan Police are, was the force they used last night appropriate compared to other COVID gatherings we've seen throughout the pandemic? And were they right to cancel an organised vigil? The police say they had to. They were acting within COVID government regulations. But one thing that they can all agree on is that this is not the outcome anybody wanted.
They were told to stay at home, but they came anyway to light up the streets for Sarah Everard.
Now, this was supposed to be the cancelled vigil, but as you can see, thousands of people have come out anyway. Sarah Everard has brought out an uncomfortable truth for many women who simply do not feel safe on the streets. They want their voices to be heard.
You got a sense in the crowd last night that at any moment the atmosphere was about to turn nasty, and it did. The images of women being restrained by officers have appalled many. The Metropolitan Police say they were left with no choice after big crowds congregated with the risk of COVID-19 spreading. This photo of 27-year-old Patsy Stevenson's arrest has hit a national nerve.
They arrested me in cuffs, dragged me away, surrounded by like 10 police officers, and when I got in the van they said, we just need your name and your address and then we'll let you go with a fine. So I don't see the point of the arrest, to be honest.
Sarah was a woman similar age to us, lived in the same area to us, and all she was doing was walking home. She had every right to be able to walk home safely. She did everything right. She wore high-vis clothing. She walked along the main streets. She rang her boyfriend.
Do you feel safe to walk down the streets?
No.
Absolutely not.
No?
No.
Absolutely not.
And I personally use keys in my hands. I know that like loads of women do the same thing. I don't know about you two, but
my sister, as a present, I was gifted rape alarms because rape alarms.
Men have to change. Men have to take action, and men have to rethink the way that they're behaving and interacting on the streets everywhere.
Tonight there are serious questions being asked about the police's response, accused across the political parties of being heavy-handed. And repeated calls for Dame Cressida Dick to resign, but tonight the Commissioner said her officers had no choice but to enforce the law.
None of us would have wanted to see the scenes we saw at the end of yesterday's events. Worth saying, of course, I fully understand the strength of feeling, I think, as a woman, and hearing from people about their experiences in the past and what they feel about what happened to Sarah and what has been going on. I understand why so many people wanted to come and pay their respects and kind of make a statement about this. Indeed, if it had been lawful, I'd have been there. I'd have been at a vigil.
The question will now be asked of the Met, was their response last night in Clapham consistent with policing at vigils across the UK?
There do seem to have been these instances later on in the evening where there are scenes and photographs that are incredibly upsetting. So I suspect the report, I hope, will address all of those issues so that we get a full picture of the decisions that were made yesterday.
Everybody who saw the images and footage of what happened last night would find it really disturbing. It was the wrong response from the police. It's right that it's now being looked into, and there will be these reports now, but it was the wrong response. It was deeply disturbing.
But a former chief constable has told us the police have a difficult line to tread during COVID.
Through the pandemic, police officers absolutely felt caught in the middle, and damned if they do and damned if they don't. But particularly on this issue about protests, and there have been political protests, political pressure about particular protests like Extension Rebellion, and Black Lives Matter.
As Priti Patel called the scenes last night upsetting, tomorrow the Home Secretary will try to bring in new laws to give greater powers to police at protests. Labour say they'll vote against the bill, as some Conservative MPs also criticise the police's response. All eyes will be on the House of Commons tomorrow as they vote. Pressure on the Metropolitan Police Commissioner this evening as protesters gathered outside New Scotland Yard. The Home Secretary said there were still questions that needed answering. As the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said the Met's response was completely unacceptable after a night when they came to be heard and some left in handcuffs.
Well, we can speak to Victor Elisa now, who's a former Chief Superintendent for the Metropolitan Police, and he was also the Met's Director of Inclusion and Diversity. Victor Elisa, when you look at those crowds in the middle of a pandemic, the Met had no choice, didn't they, but to enforce the law?
Yes, of course. I mean, we have to keep people safe when we're going through difficult times. So the Met, yes, do have to keep people safe, have to enforce the law. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. And I think it's really difficult to second guess an organisation that's got a world reputation for policing demonstrations, events really well. Yeah. So we'll wait for the review to come out and see what that tells us. I think the real damage here is the reputation to the Met.
Right, so
that's the significant issue.
Tell us what concerned you about the images you were seeing and whether you think that should lead to Cressida Dick considering her position.
Well, there was a lot of things going on there. If you consider the circumstances of people getting together for a vigil, the concern about male violence against women, and then you look at those images and you're thinking, these are the people. You know, I was a police officer, I enjoyed being a police officer, but these are the people who are there to protect sections of the community. And these are women who've come to actually express their fear about violence at the hands of men. And this is what was happening. So it just looked totally inappropriate. And there's been many commentators who've used different adjectives to describe the way they felt. And I just felt really concerned and disturbed by what I was seeing. And again, the review will tell us and the inspection will tell us, but I just, at the time, in looking at those images, I couldn't see a rationale for that level of force against women who would come to hold a vigil, not to demonstrate. And about the whether or not the Commissioner should resign, let's wait for the review and the investigation. The Commissioner will be in a good position to decide, you know, what she should do after those reviews and inspections have been published.
Okay. Do you think this will end up being a landmark moment for policing and also the way we view society in the same way that the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was?
I think it'll be a significant moment. I'm disappointed that we're having so many significant moments for policing just recently. I think it will be a significant moment, and there will be, if it was a moment that brought our policing back to the principle of policing by consent, then it'll be a wonderful place to get back to, because, yeah, the Met have got to deal with difficult issues, but we've got to show empathy.
Well, talking of empathy, and just very briefly, do you think that women tonight in London should trust the police?
I'd hope so. I would say absolutely, unquestionably, yes, because we can never get to a position where anyone, particularly at this particular moment in time where women are feeling fearful, that they cannot trust the institution that's there to keep them safe. So absolutely, yes, women should trust the police. And it's for the police to work really hard to maintain that trust.
Right. Victor Elisa, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is Labour MP Harriet Harman, who's chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights and is planning an amendment to tomorrow's police bill. Harriet Harman, you heard Cressida Dick say unlawful gatherings are unlawful gatherings. She had to do what she had to do last night.
Well, actually, the court said that a blanket ban on all vigils and gatherings is not right, and you have to look at each individual one in the circumstances. And of course, this gathering wouldn't have been unlawful if Cressida Dick had sat down with Reclaim These Streets and agreed the terms on which it could happen. But because she wouldn't agree to any of their very reasonable proposals, all the stewards that they were organising weren't able to attend, and they didn't have any ability to superintend the situation. And then, of course, they piled in, the police piled in, and I really do not want to see any of these women fined or prosecuted. I mean, this was woeful mishandling by the police. It should never have happened. And as for her saying, if it was lawful, I would have attended it, It would have been lawful had she agreed to sort the situation out. And the other thing is they've asked her this morning to meet them because the anger and the protest is still going on. She hasn't even replied. She must get out of her bunker and realise that she needs to engage with them so that they can express their concern.
Well, let me put to you what the Police Federation, the Met Police Federation, are saying. Politicians of all parties should make themselves aware of all the facts before rushing to judgment. Are you rushing to judgment on this?
Well, I am judging the Metropolitan Police for not being prepared to reach an agreement with Reclaim the Streets so that there could be a vigil safely, that perhaps restricted the number of people, that perhaps restricted what they could do, so that they could have an agreed process, but just to simply ban it altogether. But I think there's a bigger picture here, which is that the Metropolitan Commissioner kicked it off all on the wrong foot by saying, don't worry, this is a very rare occasion, everything's fine. And of course, women know from their experience things are not fine. So what we need to do, as well as sorting out the issue of protest on this, we need to see new laws to make women safe on the streets. And that's the responsibility of government and all of us in the House of Commons.
Right, and you're proposing bringing in a new violence against women bill, but you're also voting against the police bill. Now, the Conservatives say that you're voting against tougher sentences for child murderers and sex offenders. You're voting against a crackdown on knife and violent crime and Kay's Law, which was introduced after a woman died at her ex-partner's hands and while he was released under investigation. Are you concerned about that blanket voting against?
Well, this is the first in-principle discussion that there will be in the House of Commons when it comes for what's called its second reading tomorrow and Tuesday. And actually, although there are many good things in the bill, and we hope to add even more good things in the bill, there are some things that we're really concerned about. So it's very often the case that there's a vote against at first reading, and then you try and improve the bill in committee. But what is actually clear is that we need new laws to stop men curb-crawling women, to stop them following schoolgirls in their school uniform when they walk home from school in the dark. Women do not feel safe on the streets, and actually they haven't felt there's anything they can do about it. Now we need clear laws and proper enforcement.
Right, now, I'm sure looking at those images last night evoked some memories for you of a long history of female protest. Did you yourself go on the original Reclaim the Night protests, and what did they achieve?
Yes, absolutely. In the 70s, there was Reclaim the Night protest because of a series of particularly awful murders, and women took to the streets and said, we want to feel safe on the streets and not walking in fear. And we made the argument and we did our protest and nothing changed. But this situation is different because then we had virtually no women MPs, we had no women in government, women's voices weren't heard. Now women have found their way into the corridors of power, into the chamber of the House of Commons, and it's incumbent on us as women politicians to deliver for women in this country, and I believe we will.
Harriet Harman, thanks very much for joining us.